everyone, this is a video journal of our recent trip to Antarctica. We left here on February 4th, a Tuesday, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and flew down to Atlanta and from there overnight to Buenos Aires.
In Buenos Aires we had a very tense connection to make a flight out of another airport.
And we arrived in Ushuaia about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, so we had almost 24 hours of travel to get to our destination.
So the hotel that we were at was called the Las Hayas. Very pretty hotel. It was a very nice room, and we had a fantastic view of Ushuaia and the mountains just up above it.
And actually a little bit of a bonus, because when we arrived at the airport we got a bus tour of the city as they delivered other people to other hotels in town, so we got to get a little sense of the community itself, which is right on the Beagle Channel at the very southern tip of South America.
The next day we took off in the morning and went into Ushuaia. We had a great lunch at a spot called La Stanza. The lunches there were fantastic. In fact, they were so good we were there 2 days in a row.
The restaurant specializes in grilled meats. They have wooden fires, and the meat is spread out on racks and grilled slowly over the fire, and you can tell the chef what you want and he'll put it on a plate, and then you take it and get side dishes, and it was very good, along with some really great wine.
And we had a fantastic waiter who recommended the wine, and he had a great sense of humor. He was fun.
The next day in Ushuaia we did some walking around town, and one of the nice features of town was that local artists have done some really imaginative graffiti on some of the walls.
They're more like murals, not just graffiti. They're very elaborate murals.
Ushuaia was once the home of a prison back in the 1800s and up until the 1900s, and many of the prisoners there were political. So prison life is a large part of the history of Ushuaia, and you see it reflected around the town. We walked down by the waterfront and got a good view of the harbor. There were a couple of ships in at the pier at that point. One of them was a large one, the Celebrity Infinity, and the smaller blue ship next to it was another Quark ship, the Sea Diamond, which had just come in. The Infinity carries well over 1,000 passengers down to Antarctica, and interestingly, none of them ever go ashore. There's just too many passengers for them to do that.
So on February 7th, we had to have all of our bags down in the hotel lobby to be transported to the ship. And then we took off for the day, and we did not need to report to board the ship until about 3 in the afternoon.
So we got on a bus and were driven out onto the pier, and then we walked up the gangplank of the Sea Spirit and were greeted and guided to our room on the 4th deck.
They pulled the anchor, and we started sailing out towards the ocean down the Beagle Channel.
During the trip down the Beagle Channel, we had our usual abandoned ship drill with everybody dressed up in their life vests, and we got our parkas, which are the one free thing we got for our trip. The most expensive free parkas we ever got, plus boots, which were loaned to us for the trip. And late in the evening, the pilot who was aboard was taken to shore by a pilot boat that came out to greet the ship as we got close to the ocean.
Yeah, the pilot had the job of transporting us through the Beagle Channel. Legally, he had to be the one to do it. So the next day, the next 2 days, we were actually crossing the Drake, which takes us over towards the Antarctic Peninsula, and we had been told the seas could be rough, and indeed they were. There was quite a storm, and they made the decision, rather than to try to race and beat the storm, to wait a little bit and slow down and go behind it.
There was some seasickness amongst passengers, and in fact around the ship they had strategically placed paper bags ready for anybody who just suddenly lost it. Some of those disappeared, and the head count at meals began to drop a little bit, but fortunately we didn't have too much of a problem with it.
And it was sort of bizarre too, looking at the ocean at that point too, because the water looked like metal, just waves of metal.
And other times when the sun was out, it would be this very dark blue. And there was all kinds of wildlife out there, especially birds, albatrosses and petrels and even some dolphins. Monday the 10th was our first sighting of land on Antarctica. And as we woke up and looked out the cabin window, we could see mountains sticking up out of the water, completely covered in snow and ice. It was quite amazing. Okay, Monday morning we went to Half Moon Island, and it was our first shore excursion in a Zodiac.
Good morning, everyone. Can you just shuffle back towards me? Does everybody have their life jackets on the correct way? Challenger facing out. Your backpacks are all off? No bags on you?
Yep.
Excellent. My name is Diane. I will be driving you to shore this morning. Please hold on to the rope behind you as we go along. There's a bit of swell. Some water may come over the bow. Meantime, just hold on and enjoy the ride.
Yeah, some of the Zodiac trips were rather mild, and some, depending on the speed we were going, were a little wilder, and we held on for dear life.
The first thing we saw when we came ashore was a rookery of Chinstrap penguins. We saw several types of penguins during the trip, but the Chinstraps were the first we saw, and the reason they have that name is rather obvious.
These penguins create a highway as they go back and forth between their rookeries and the ocean. And you can see they leave a trail, and we were not allowed to walk on their highways, and we had very specific highways that we had to travel to stay out of their way. And they wanted us to stay at least 10 to 15 feet away from them and not to approach them, but if they came to us, that was okay.
And it was easy to tell which penguins were going out to the ocean and which were coming back, because the ones going to the ocean were all dirty from having hung around on land in the rookeries, and the ones coming back from the ocean were all clean from having slept in the water, or swam in the water, and so you could really see the difference as they passed each other.
On the beach you could see the penguins coming and going, and they would kind of wade into the water, stick their head under the water a little bit, look up around again, put their head down again, and suddenly just disappear. And coming out, it was just the opposite. The waves would come in, and suddenly one would just pop up out of a wave and then scurry like mad to get up on the shore before the next wave got him.
And up on the ridge of the rookery there was a small group of fur seals that were sitting out there mostly sleeping. What was really beautiful there was that the whole area around this rookery and the island was glaciers coming right down to the water, and with the light changing, and it just had beautiful shafts of light shining on the snow and the ice.
So we went back to the ship and had lunch, and then suited up in all our myriad of gear and headed to Deception Island after lunch, which was actually a volcano, and a still active volcano, with one side that had been breached. The wall had been broken in.
And so the ship was able to sail through that breach into the caldera, which is filled with water, and it's close to 7 miles across. It's huge. The breach in the wall is called Neptune's Bellows.
The island was once a whaling station until about the mid-1930s.
And then scientific research stations operated there until the 60s, when there was some additional volcanic eruptions and they were forced out of there. There's not anything in there now because of the concern that there might be another eruption.
So we went ashore near an old whaling station, and you could see a lot of the remnants from the station that was there. We thought at least it would be sheltered since we were surrounded by the walls of the volcano, the cone of the volcano, but it was extremely windy and very, very cold.
You could see a lot of the old rusting machinery from the whaling station, rusting tanks that were used to store petroleum and also to store whale oil after it was processed, and the tanks they used to boil down the blubber to get the oil. There was a large area of whale bones and wooden staves from barrels back of the beach. There were signs of the activity that had been there. We both thought it must have been an amazing but very grim place to carry out an occupation of working in this business.
But we did have one very unique opportunity to see something that was not planned and probably most people never saw, and that was an emperor penguin that had gotten stranded in Deception Island because he was molting, and he couldn't go back into the ocean until the molt was complete.
One of the crew told us that we were about as likely to see a parrot in that caldera as we would an emperor penguin, because its nearest rookery is way the other side of the peninsula. But we were fortunate to see it, and we heard later that it had gone into the water about a week later when another Quark ship came in and headed out to sea.
There was a notch in the wall of the caldera that we were also able to hike up to, and that was called Neptune's Window. And after hiking up a rather icy steep path to get up to the top and look over the ridge, we had a nice view out to the ocean.
As we were walking over to climb up the notch path, we were walking along the beach, and I told Robin to look at the Weddell seal along the beach. Well, it was so well camouflaged, she practically walked up to it.
There were also fur seals that were along our designated highway, and occasionally they would go into mock battles and sort of lock mouths with each other and then suddenly flop down and go back to sleep.
On Tuesday the 11th, we went to a place called Enterprise Island in the morning and saw some amazing stuff, including whales feeding and also a shipwreck. The whales feeding were just absolutely amazing. As soon as we got in the Zodiac, we heard on the radio that there were a group of them down at one of this giant bay that were coming to the surface and then diving and feeding. So we zipped over there in the Zodiac and then just spent an hour or so sitting and watching them come up and go down. You could hear them breathing, you could hear them rumbling, you could see their spouts. It was really amazing.
There was also a wreck of an old whaling ship, the Governor Norin.
Gouvernorin.
It was an oil ship, and it caught fire, and so the captain ran it aground. All people were able to get off safely, but the wreck is still there, and there are a lot of birds that we saw nesting in it, and got some rather interesting photographs of it.
The ship actually went aground in 1916, so it's close to 100 years since that event took place, but is still fairly well intact, but obviously rusting quite a deal. This was a whaling ship, and the oil aboard the ship had caught fire and caused the disaster.
That evening, there were a lot of humpback whales that were feeding near the ship, and also that evening, 30 of the passengers elected to do an overnight on a nearby island, Ronge Island. That was their big campout. So they took off, and they had special sleeping bags that they slept in on the ice. They did not have tents as such. And they spent the night there and then came back the next morning in time for breakfast.
We visited Danko Island on Tuesday afternoon. This was an island with a steep slope up to one penguin rookery for Gentoos. And there was actually another rookery at the very top of the hill, and the penguins had to cover quite a distance to get up there. One of the experts told us that they like open rocky areas to nest, and there aren't too many of them, so wherever they are, that's what they use for nests. So we had to do some climbing to get halfway up the hill to see this, but what a view of the bay.
And these penguins are also very distinctive because they have an orange beak, which none of the other penguins did. So we could tell them apart. And when they talk to each other, it sounds like braying donkeys. It's quite a sound to hear. And there was a lot of that going on in the rookeries.
The Gentoos were the second type of penguin that we saw during our trip, and we were told that they usually raise about 2 chicks each season. The overall survival rate for chicks is only about 30%, but it's enough for the Gentoo population to be on the increase in this part of Antarctica, while other penguin populations, particularly Adelies, are on decline. The chicks of the Gentoos at the time we were there were about 2 or 3 weeks away from molting and being able to go to sea for the first time and to feed on their own. But right now they're very demanding of food from their parents, and their parents are constantly going back and forth to the water to get krill to feed them. Meanwhile, the Gentoo chicks are slowly losing the down that covers them, and once that's all gone and they have their adult feathers, they can go to sea.
When we hiked up to this halfway point, there was quite a view of the bay, and we could look down and see the ship and some really huge icebergs off in the distance. So after we watched the penguins, we did take a Zodiac trip, a nice leisurely one back to the ship, and along the way we were able to see up quite close seals, especially a leopard seal, which is a vicious creature when he opens his mouth and you see his teeth, and some icebergs up quite close too. It was a nice trip back.
On Wednesday, our morning trip took us to Cuverville Island, which was site of another Gentoo colony, one of the larger ones in the area. We landed on an open rocky beach, and I was able to get a lot of pictures of Gentoos coming and going from the water.
When they swim, they're actually fun to watch because they look like porpoise, and they just leap in and out of the water exactly like a porpoise.
Part of that is to breathe as they swim through the water, and they're very fast. And part of it is they travel in groups for safety, because sometimes leopard seals will lie in wait off the water or off the shore and try and get them. I set up my GoPro camera on the beach and was able to get some good shots as the penguins walked back and forth along the waterfront.
So in the afternoon, we once again boarded our Zodiacs and we went to Bill's Island, which was also a Gentoo penguin colony. And while we hiked around there, we came across sort of an array of whale bones, and then hiked a little bit further and saw them all arranged. There were a bunch of whale bones that had been arranged pretty much in the order that the whale would have had them when it was living. And we spent a little bit of time there so that they could then port us over to Port Lockroy. And that was an interesting site, which was restored by the Antarctic Heritage Trust of London.
It had originally been a former British scientific research station and was used for doing research on the ionosphere. Now they have taken this entire facility, which was closed down in the 60s, and restored it, and it's run as a museum of what the scientific station looked like when it was running, as well as a gift shop and even a post office, so you can go into the gift shop and buy memorabilia and postcards and have them mailed from there. Only thing is, the postcards don't actually get mailed until the end of March, when the 4 women who run the facility during the summer months down there go back to the Falkland Islands on their way home to London. One of the fun things during this visit, as Robin mentioned, we weren't allowed to walk up to penguins, but if penguins walked up to us, it was fine. So Robin was sitting down outside the Port Lockroy station when a Gentoo chick walked up to her and practically tapped her on the foot. And at one point, you tried to carry on a conversation.
Doug suggested I make a sound like a penguin, which I tried to do, and it turned its head and it looked at me and then ran like mad in the opposite direction.
So we bought some cards and we mailed them, and they still haven't shown up yet at the time we're doing this.
And today is March 7th. So on Thursday, February 13th, we started going through Lemaire Channel. And actually that was a very narrow channel with lots of high snow-capped mountains on either side, and also one particular peak that was named Una's Tits by the sailors that went through there for rather obvious reasons.
Apparently it was named after a fondly remembered barmaid at some distant port. We were headed for Peterman Island, and that's home to a mixed rookery of Gentoos, a few Adelie penguins, and a bird called a blue-eyed shag. It's also an Antarctic cormorant. The adult Adelie is about the same size as a Gentoo. They look a fair amount alike, but you can tell the difference again by the beak color. The Gentoo has the orangish-red beak. The Adelie is black, and the Adelie's head is all black with a ring around its eye.
At the time we were there, most of the Adelie adults had already gone to sea, leaving the chicks behind. They still had about another 2 to 3 weeks of molding before they would head back to sea, and that's when they would start feeding on the krill. But they were in no condition yet to get back in the water, and there were some that were still so young that it was suspected they probably wouldn't make it.
It's interesting because the young are left on their own for the last 2 or 3 weeks. They're not getting fed because they can't go get food themselves and their parents have gone. So purely on instinct, as soon as the molding is done, they go down to the water and jump in and learn how to feed and survive. It's pretty amazing. But in those last 2 or 3 weeks, for both exercise and for survival, they gather up in large groups called creches and kind of run around together on the rocks. Sometimes the skuas, the Antarctic gulls, try and catch them, and so they get into groups and try and fend them off.
The cormorants that we saw on the island feed their young on krill also, and they open their mouths and the young put their beaks way down the throat. It looks like their whole head is about to disappear into the mother's mouth. The Gentoo also feed their chicks basically the same way, but their young don't put their heads halfway down the throat, but they open their mouths and regurgitate krill that the young then try to feed on.
In the afternoon, we were supposed to go back up the Lemaire Channel to a place called Plano Bay and look at a large collection of icebergs there. But as can sometimes happen in the Antarctic, a storm came up very suddenly as we were heading back up the channel. The wind started blowing, and because of the narrowness of the channel, It was very, very windy. We had gusts of 59 knots, which is close to 70 miles an hour, and snow and sleet were blowing horizontally across the ship, so much so that it was causing the ship to lean in the wind. I went out on the side deck and walked forward with my GoPro, which was in a protective casing, to get pictures of the storm, and at one point saw some seals lying on an ice floe. They looked like they were going to jump off and go back in the water, but after a little pause they looked at the ship and said, and stayed there.
So on Friday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, our first trip of the day was to Danko Harbour.
As fast as you can, don't go down there, take photos of penguins. You need to stay away from the beach at all times because sometimes the waves come out of nowhere. You haven't heard the calving, it's quite shallow and the waves do build. So stay off the beach at all times. Then you can see where the yellow jackets are going. You follow the path around and you sort of follow some old planks of wood that are there from an old hut. You'll go through a penguin colony. Remember, try and keep your 5 meters, and you'll wrap around the back and around and up to Liliana. You need to follow the flags. If you want to just chill out, you can spend time on the flat area but not on the beach at the front here if you don't really want to go hiking. So you can come around, and then if you have a look, you can see like a big zigzag that goes up to the right and then goes along to the left behind you. That's taking you up to the high viewpoint. Once you go past Liliana, it is imperative you stay on the track, or you may be walking next to the track because the track might be slippery like yesterday, but you need to follow flag to flag. There are crevasses up there that are starting to open up now that may be hidden by the snow we just had, so it is really important that you pretty much follow those flags exactly.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day, love.
Weird place to be celebrating Valentine's.
It is.
Gorgeous.
Not everyone is this lucky. And we went to the harbor and saw lots and lots of beautiful mountains and glaciers that came all the way down to the sea. And you could hear cracking sounds all around the harbor that we were in as bits of ice broke off and fell into the water.
We hoped we might see a major chunk of something fall off, but unfortunately we never did. Although, as Robin said, we heard a lot of cracks, and some of them sounded major, but then we'd see just ripples in the water from a fairly small chunk of ice. I set up my GoPro camera and just left it running, aimed at the glacier itself, and managed to catch a small avalanche, which you can see here. It's interesting to note the time it takes from the point where the avalanche starts to where the person down below on the shore reacts to the sound and looks up and points at it. It's about 9 seconds, so it tells you how long the sound took to reach her before she finally reacted.
Then in the afternoon, we were back in the Zodiacs again and went to Paradise Harbor, which is the site of Argentina's Brown Summer Research Station. So we went ashore there. We were 9,000 miles from the North Pole at that point. And we looked around the station. There were some old buildings that we were not permitted to go to. And unlike Port Lockroy, they did not really want to entertain us. So we were free to walk around, but they did not come out to meet us.
There was a hill nearby and actually a pretty steep climb up to an overlook of the harbor. We didn't go up quite that high, but still had a great view of the waters of Paradise Harbor. It was starting to snow.
Which was one of the few days that we actually had snow while we were there. And sitting in the Zodiac in the middle of this harbor, the Zodiac driver turned the engine off, and we just sat there and listened to the silence and watched the snow come down. And it was truly beautiful and a fantastic way to end the trip.
Cormorants were nesting on a steep cliff face, and they'd swoop down from that over the water to feed. We saw crab-eater seals and a leopard seal dozing on ice floes in the bay. There were many smaller birds floating in the water, and one of them had very, very clear ice. Robin picked up a piece of it and held it. It was under such pressure that it forced most of the air bubbles out of it, which made it so very, very clear.
But our treats were not over, even though that was our last Zodiac expedition. We got back to the ship and it was time for the polar plunge. This is when anyone who is a passenger or even a crew member can elect to jump into the water and then hop back right out again and into a hot tub. So there were 29 people that decided to do it. They were disappointed because they said normally about 40% do, but it was still an event to see.
Each person who did it walked down the gangway to the Zodiac and had a safety belt put around their waist. Just the thought of that wet, cold belt being put around the waist made my back tighten up just looking at it. And then they would jump off the Zodiac. Most of them came right back out of the water, but a few brave souls swam out to another Zodiac or even did a little water ballet. A few had GoPro cameras and took them with them to record it as they jumped into the water. But it was chilly.
And then before dinner, we all gathered on deck 5 at the stern and had a huge photo taken of all of us together.
Including the crew. And the crew, we have to say, were just absolutely amazing. The expedition leaders really knew their subject matter. They were experts on geology and the environment and history and ornithology. And they really had a lot of information throughout the trip, not only in lectures on board the ship, but when people asked them questions when we were riding around in Zodiacs or ashore. We really enjoyed them.
And their expertise went well beyond their own particular area of interest, too. So they were a wonderful, wonderful addition to what we saw.
Our final part of the journey was a trip back across the Drake Passage. We started sailing late on Saturday afternoon, and we had a few hints that it might be rough, and it was. It was about as rough as it was coming across the other way with pretty large waves. But we didn't get seasick. It was rocky, but we made it back. And on Sunday afternoon, we had a real treat. We got to sail right by Cape Horn, the fabled tip of South America, where so many sailors have battled over the years and some died to make that journey through some of the wildest weather on Earth. This narrative and the photos and the videos, and thanks to all the people who contributed through the DVD we got at the end of the voyage, and we hope you enjoyed our narrative.
And while you may have enjoyed the narrative and the videos and the photos, there is nothing like actually being there and experiencing it, and if you ever get the opportunity, you should do it.
Here we are coming up to Deception Island.